Appendix VII. Speculative and practical. On the proper mode of moral philosophy. By the very fact that practical knowledge is like a continuous movement of thought inclined toward concrete action to be posited in existence, its practical character, present from the beginning, is progressively intensified and in prudence becomes wholly dominant. There it is all-pervasive, and although the prudential judgment always implies a knowing, its proper truth does not consist in knowing what is, but in directing what is to be done. So long as there is science, on the contrary, knowledge always remains speculative to some degree, and in the order of practical knowledge, it is moral philosophy that represents its most scientific degree. Moral philosophy proposes to regulate action from afar, and therefore, to act from afar upon the will through knowledge itself. It is in view of this end that it organizes its materials into a practical context and discovers the ontological articulations which are concerned with action by adapting to its practical end a conceptual equipment, to wit, those modes of defining and judging which are typically speculative. Unlike prudence, which consists formally in directing and not in knowing, the truth of judgments in moral philosophy consists formally in knowing, knowing as the foundation of directing. This is why we have said that moral philosophy proceeds in a practical manner as to its proper finalities, the conditions of its object, and therefore its proper law of argumentation, and that its mode remains nevertheless speculative and explanatory as regards the general or fundamental equipment of knowledge. From this aspect, moral philosophy is considered strictly as philosophy or speculatively practical knowledge, as opposed to strictly practical knowledge such as it exists in practically practical moral sciences, and to the highest degree in prudence. A text from John of St. Thomas throws the speculative mode of moral philosophy into strong, perhaps too strong, relief. Moral science can be considered in two ways. One way, as it also includes prudence. Another way, as it excludes it and only deals with the knowledge of virtues speculatively. If it excludes prudence and only treats the matter of virtues by defining, dividing, etc., it is speculative, as is done in theology, in the first part of the second part. It does not use practical principles or a practical mode, that is, as moving and inclining effectively but precisely speculative, as it knows the nature of virtues and prudence in the reason of truth, as can be seen in ethics and in the whole first part of the second part. And so one can be a distinguished ethical philosopher and theologian and an imprudent sinner. It is because moral philosophy thus proceeds speculatively, not operatively, breaking up human acts and their very morality according to the intelligible constitutives which explain them, and making use of the necessary and evident principles proper to it. That moral philosophy remains a science properly so called, able to deduce certain and infallible conclusions with respect to work from first naturally known principles. However, lest a hasty reading of the above-quoted text of John of St. Thomas lead us astray, and lest we imagine that moral philosophy is a purely and simply speculative science, a metaphysics or a psychology of the virtues, we must remember that, as St. Thomas repeatedly teaches, the reason why practical philosophy is distinguished essentially from speculative philosophy is that it is from the very outset directed toward operation and considers the operable insofar as it is operable. Thus, the formal reason under which it attains its object, the scientific task to which it is ordered, the spiritual light animating and directing it, are other than those proper to the speculative sciences. It is distinguished from these latter by the very intrinsic order to objects, from which one knowledge has to regard only the truth in itself in the abstract, another according to those things which are required to be posited in the exercise of existence. From this point of view, it must be said that moral philosophy itself proceeds according to a practical and compositive mode, since the mode and end of science accompany each other, as Cajetan says. For if ethics is distinguished from speculative philosophy by its formal reason, under which why should it not also be distinguished from it by its mode of knowing? As we have already said, the mode of knowing is to be understood as practical and compositive in respect to the conditions of the object known, human acts, which object is considered in relation to its ends and in its practical values, and referred to the first principles of synderesis. For this reason, moral philosophy is oriented from the beginning toward the operable taken as such, and toward the positing of acts in existence, hence the proper characteristics of moral philosophy which we have pointed out. Hence its proper law of argumentation, directed toward the concrete synthesis of action. And hence it results that it is a normative science, that it necessarily takes into account not only what is but what should be, and that it involves the consideration of ends, especially of the final end, for in the practical order ends play the same role as principles in the speculative order. But the fact remains that what moral philosophy thus prepares and gathers up in view of operations to be directed from afar is knowledge whose structure is wholly intellectual, whose truth implies neither regulation by right appetite nor effective motion, and which examines its different objects according to the laws of ontological analysis, dividing and resolving, in order to grasp their intelligible constituent. Thus, in moral philosophy, the mode of science is not practical but speculative regarding the fundamental equipment of knowledge and the structure of notions and definitions. We are dealing here only with the first degree of the adaptation of intellectual equipment to a practical end. In the practically practical sciences, and in prudence, the very structure of this equipment is modified, as explained in Chapter 8, Sections 3 and 13. Although truth in moral philosophy does not consist purely and simply in knowing as it does in speculative philosophy, it does at least consist in knowing as the foundation of directing. Whereas, in practically practical science, truth consists in directing based upon knowing, and in prudence, it consists formally simply and solely in directing itself. This is the correct interpretation of the text of John of St. Thomas, which we quoted at the beginning of these remarks. From these remarks, it can be seen how the operable thing can be considered precisely as operable in three different ways. From the point of view of knowledge, considered above all as knowing, or considered as already operating also, or considered above all as operating. It can also be seen how true it is to say that moral philosophy proceeds in a practical manner in respect to the conditions of the object known and the process of reasoning, and in a speculative manner in respect to the means themselves of apprehending and judging. We might note here that the expression practically practical should be understood in a more or less strict fashion, quite strict in the case of prudence, more broadly in the case of the practically practical sciences. General remarks about the speculative and the practical. For the distinction between the speculative and the practical, the following texts may be consulted. St. Thomas, in Metaphysics, Book 2, Lecture 2, in Ethics, Book 1, Lectures 1 and 3, in Politics, Book 1, Lecture 1, Summa Theologica, I, 1, 4, in Boethius on the Trinity, Question 5, Article 1, in Posterior Analytics, Lecture 1, in On the Soul, Book 3, Lecture 15, Summa Theologica, I, 14, 16, on Truth, 2, 8, 3, 3. John of St. Thomas, Logic, Zaka 2, Question 1, Question 4, Theological Course, Volume 1, I, Question 1, Disputation 2, Article 10. When you try to group these texts together in a single synthesis, it is a delicate task to interpret them properly due to the multitude of cross-currents between the speculative and the practical, and the diversity of degrees within the practical itself. As St. Thomas constantly repeats, after Aristotle, it is by the ends they seek to contemplate an object to do something that the speculative and the practical differ. But the very ordination to a practical end can itself affect knowledge to very different degrees. Furthermore, what noetics is concerned with is the ordination of knowledge itself to a practical end. But a complication arises from the fact that in the last three texts listed above, which are the classical texts upon this question, St. Thomas is dealing with a particular problem. Is divine knowledge speculative? Consequently, he speaks of what is speculative or practical by the end, while thinking of the actual ordination or non-ordination of the knowing subject to a practical end. In other words, he is thinking of the actual use which the subject makes of their knowledge, and that depends upon the latter's free will, and could not enter into the specification of their habit, f. Cajetan, in I Am, 14, 16, John of St. Thomas, Theological Course, Art Cita C, Nice 15. Keeping this in mind, and thus avoiding further complications, we can set up the following diagram, showing the division of knowledge from the point of view of the speculative and the practical. In respect to the end and the object, the theoretical or speculative intellect is properly distinguished from the operative or practical in this, that the speculative has for its end the truth which it considers, while the practical considers the truth, in order to direct it to action as its end. And therefore the philosopher says in On the Soul, Book 3, that they differ by their end, and in Metaphysics, Book 2, it is said that the end of the speculative is truth. The end of the operative or practical is action. Since the matter must be proportionate to the end, the matter of the practical sciences must be those things which can be made by our work, so that their knowledge can be directed to action as to an end. The matter of the speculative sciences, however, must be things which are not made by our work, hence their consideration cannot be directed to action as to an end, and according to the distinction of these things, the speculative sciences must be distinguished. St. Thomas, in Boethius on the Trinity, Question 5, Article 1. Practical knowledge is affected by the extension of the speculative to work. On Truth, Question 2, Article 8, Sifa Summa Theologica, I 79, 11, in On the Soul, Book 3, Lecture 15, 430 A 14 to 15. In respect to the mode, in practical knowledge, the artisan devises the form of the artifact and knows by the mode of operating. Then the thing is considered as operable, when in it are considered all the things required for its being together. On Truth, Question 3, Article 3. Science can be called speculative first from the part of the things known, which are not operable by the knower, as is the science of man about natural or divine things. Secondly, as to the mode of knowing, for example, if a builder considers a house by defining and dividing, and considering the universal predicates of it, this indeed is to consider operable things in a speculative mode, and not according to the mode of operating. It should be noted that in this question, when he speaks of scientific knowledge in the speculative mode of an object of operation, St. Thomas is not thinking of what we are here calling speculatively practical knowledge, such as moral philosophy. As Cajetan remarks, he is thinking of a purely speculative knowledge of an object which happens to be operable in other respects. It is thus that God knows the things he makes or can make, with a knowledge that is not only practical, but also speculative, and which corresponds supereminently to our purely speculative knowledge of these same objects. Thus, in taking over from St. Thomas the distinction between science which is practical in its object and speculative in its mode, and science which is practical both in its mode and its object, some of his disciples applied it differently. Consequently, they call mode of knowing practical in the first case, speculative still in the second, the classical distinction between the knowledge typical of prudence, or art, or practical science, and the knowledge characteristic of moral philosophy. Examples of this procedure may be found in John of St. Thomas, Gudin, and Gret. We have already explained how in one view this still speculative mode of moral philosophy does not prevent it, as Gudin says, from being entirely practical, from the fact of its essential ordination to a practical end. This distinction between the speculative, in respect to the means of knowledge, mode of moral philosophy, and the practical mode of strictly practical sciences, and especially of prudence, makes it possible to reconcile easily apparently opposed statements found in the writings of the ancients, where, on the one hand, they vigorously distinguish between moral philosophy and prudence, and, on the other hand, insist upon the specifically practical character of moral philosophy and its continuity, not in essence but in tendency or direction, with prudence. At the beginning of the article from which the text quoted above is taken, and which overemphasized the speculative character of moral science, John of St. Thomas writes, Practical and speculative require different principles in the formal reason of knowing, since speculative principles proceed in a resolutive manner and only tend to manifest the truth according to the connection and dependence on the formal principles of such truth. Practical principles, however, neither resolve nor illuminate the truth as to their formal principles and essence, almost abstracting from existence, but apply and order it to bring it into being, and thus proceed in a compositive manner. And so practical and speculative principles differ more in the reason of knowing and illuminating than two speculative principles, which constitute different species of science. These remarks obviously apply to moral philosophy as well as to prudence and the strictly practical sciences, since moral philosophy is from the outset divided off from the whole order of speculative philosophy. Yet they must be applied to moral philosophy otherwise than to prudence, since the latter is distinguished from moral philosophy as practical knowledge from science. This twofold fact is explained by the distinction between the speculatively practical and the practically practical. In respect to speculative philosophy and practical philosophy, when philosophy or arts are distinguished by the theoretical and practical, the distinction must be taken from the end, so that practical is said to be that which is ordered to operation, and theoretical that which is ordered to the sole cognition of truth. It is the wise person's role to order. According to the different orders which reason properly considers, there are different sciences. For the order which reason makes in its own act pertains to rational philosophy or logic, but to natural philosophy or physics pertains the consideration of the order of things, which human reason considers but does not make. So that under natural philosophy we include metaphysics. But the order of voluntary actions pertains to the consideration of moral philosophy. In respect to prudence and art, moral science, although it is for the sake of operation, yet that operation is not the act of science, but the act of virtue, as is clear in ethics. Hence it cannot be called art, but rather in those operations virtue takes the place of art. When medicine is divided into theoretical and practical, the division is not according to the end. For thus the whole of medicine is contained under the practical, as it is ordered to operation. But the division is according to whether the things treated in medicine are near or remote from operation. That part of medicine is called practical, which teaches the modes of operation for healing, such as that such remedies are to be applied to such abscesses. Theoretical is called that part which teaches the principles by which a person is directed in operation, but not immediately, such as that there are 3 virtues, and that there are so many kinds of fevers. Hence it is not necessary, if some part of an active science is called theoretical, that for this reason that part is placed under speculative science. This text shows very clearly that for St. Thomas moral philosophy, which differs from speculative philosophy according to the end, also belongs to the practical order and has, with prudence and the other practically practical moral sciences, a relation analogous to that which theoretical medicine has with practical medicine. As Cajetan writes, science of the operable, whether it is through the proximate principles of operation or through the remote and universal principles of operation, falls under the same category. In respect to the degree of certitude, the closer a science approaches singulars, as operative sciences, such as medicine, alchemy, and morals, the less certainty they can have, because of the multitude of things that must be considered in such sciences. Where if any one thing is omitted, errors frequently occur, and because of their variability, it is important to note that certain apparent difficulties can arise from the flexibility of the scholastic vocabulary. For example, the term scientia practica may sometimes be stretched to include prudence itself. The effective continuity of the whole order of the practical might justify this flexibility of vocabulary. The more we meditate on the moral teaching of St. Thomas, the more we are aware that this concrete continuity is constantly presupposed, without prejudice to the differences in nature between the faculties or habits concerned. From moral philosophy to the prudent act, one single concrete intention traverses the whole order of practical thought, which becomes less and less science, the more it becomes practical. This is why the ancients not only sometimes assimilated prudence, which is distinguished from science, into practical science, but also sometimes extended moral philosophy to include prudence. This continuity also explains why the ancients included in moral philosophy all wisdom concerned with human acts, in the same way as they included in natural philosophy all wisdom concerning the things of nature. We believe that just as the progressive differentiation of the sciences has brought out a clearer distinction between the experimental disciplines and the philosophy of nature, so likewise, without breaking the effective continuity of the practical order, a similar difference should be recognized between moral philosophy and the practically practical moral sciences. The mode which is practical and compositive, not only in respect to the conditions of the object known, but also in respect to the very structure of the means of apprehending and judging, characterizes not only prudence, which immediately governs the act to be done here and now, by a judgment and command appropriate to the absolute individualization of the concrete case, but it also characterizes, although to a lesser degree, a science of human action whose object, unlike that of prudence, is to organize universal truths. This science proceeds to do so, not through remote principles of operation as moral philosophy does, but through proximate principles of operation. Consequently, it must depend on practical principles in its fundamental equipment and in its very knowledge value. Its means of knowledge must be fundamentally impregnated with practicality, and it will yield that complete and assured truth proper to science only when it presupposes in the teacher an authentic experience of the concrete term to which it directs those who are taught. This experience does not stem from communicable wisdom. It depends upon the prudent judgment itself, wherein speculative principles and criteria are completed by regulations that issue from moral virtues and rectitude of will. This notion of strictly practical science was developed by St. Thomas rather in the line of artistic making and in relation to art. But the explanation we are discussing here is necessary if the nuances of the real are to be respected, and it is in complete conformity with the principles and spirit of his doctrine. When we recognize that such a science also has a place in the line of human action, we see more clearly the continuous movement of thought, which passes from ethical considerations to the positing of the prudent act. At the same time, we see more clearly the difference in mode between moral science, in which the intellect alone enters into play, and that science in which the intellect works in conjunction with the experience proper to prudence and with the inclinations of the appetite. That is why we insisted so strongly upon the importance of practically practical science in the case of St. John of the Cross. Analogous remarks should suitably be made about that very great practical as well as speculative moralist, St. Alphonsus Liguori. The teaching of these saints is, to our mind, a much purer example of practically practical moral science than are certain works on casuistry, which can be reproached for being both too speculative in mode and tending to misunderstand the absolutely irreducible role of the virtue of prudence in the proper regulation of human acts, a virtue which no science could ever replace, because only prudence can judge infallibly of the contingent itself. Prudence is clearly a habit specifically distinct from either speculatively or practically practical moral science, since an ignorant person can be prudent in their personal conduct, and since, strictly speaking, prudence, like the other moral virtues, supposes only the first naturally known principles of practical reason and information derived from experience. It does, however, need to be enlightened by moral science by taking counsel, and in some cases, for example, when a person has to counsel or direct others, it requires science in the subject itself. As we have indicated above, we think that, on the other hand, strictly practical moral science supposes prudence, and therefore the other moral virtues, if not in respect to the experimental material and partial truths it can gather up, at least for its complete truth and scientific certitude. For such a science is an extension of moral philosophy into the practical field as such. How, then, could it be stabilized in the practically true were it not centered in prudence and in experience of prudent conduct? St. John of the Cross and St. Alphonsus were able to produce absolutely sure practical doctrine only because they were not only learned, but prudent and experienced. Is this practical science a habit distinct from moral philosophy or theology? Certainly, it is not a habit specifically distinct from theology. For theology, being as it were a certain impression in us of the science of God and the blessed, is in its very essence eminently practical. And there is less difference between the practically practical and the speculatively practical than there is between the practical and the speculative. The practical science of which we speak should be considered as a special development of the theological habit. On the other hand, in the philosophical order, in which habits are more distinct from that of moral philosophy, although the fundamentally speculative structure of the means of knowledge used by moral philosophy does not suffice to classify it in the speculative order, these means are involved in the typical movement of knowledge characterized by its practical finality. Within the practical genus, a different notional structure and mode of defining should denote a specific diversity. Therefore, we do not think it is enough to say that the strictly practical moral sciences are simply particular developments of the habitus of moral philosophy. They must differ specifically from this habitus, just as arithmetic and geometry, the philosophy of nature and the experimental natural sciences, prudence and its associated virtues, respectively, differ specifically from each other. In what concerns the line of the factibile or the work of art, if we reflect that art is more purely intellectual and less voluntary than prudence, and is fulfilled in the act of judging, not of commanding, what is to be made, and that logic and the other sciences of the trivium and quadrivium are both speculative sciences and arts at the same time, we shall reach the conclusion that the practical science of the work to be made and practical art are not two distinct habitus, but rather two formal aspects of the same habitus. However, one of these aspects may be more marked than the other in different particular cases. The art aspect predominates, for example, in a Mussorgsky, or in some physician who frequently cures patients and seems to work by rule of thumb. The science aspect predominates in a Da Vinci or in a physician who is more learned but effects fewer cures. Yet the theoretical part and the practical part of one and the same art, like medicine, stem from the same specific habitus, whereas in our opinion, moral philosophy and the practically practical moral sciences are specifically different habitus,